Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time I'm going to try and sort of combine two questions into one answer, and the first one is from Meme Boy Richard, who asked, "Hey Thor, in your honest opinion, do you think the Rey movie will be a success and will make money? How likely is it that it will be a success, do you think?" And that question is going to be packaged with this one from Veteran Torf, who asked, "Hey Thor, do you think the praise for the prequels in recent years stems only from nostalgia and subsequent third-party media like the TV shows, books, and video games, rather than from reevaluation of the movies themselves?" Alright, so the reason I put these two together is because another question I see or get asked all the time is, what if anything can save the sequels? Meaning basically, is there anything Disney and Lucasfilm can do to make those who currently don't like the sequels, maybe not suddenly love the films themselves or anything, but sort of, or at the very least, salvage the time period for them to the point where they'll maybe begrudgingly accept the films as canon, if not garner some appreciation for them, or again, the time period on the whole. The same way it often gets assumed that the Clone Wars animated series did something like this for the prequels, that thanks to that series, people who initially didn't like the film sort of came around and at the very least learned to appreciate the time period, or maybe the greater story Lucas was going for, or just didn't hate the prequels anymore and accepted them as part of the larger canon. And though I certainly think some people or fans probably had at least some level of a change of heart towards the prequels because of the Clone Wars, I think if you maybe didn't love them but thought they were okay and then watched the Clone Wars and really enjoyed that, you maybe came around, if you will. But I don't know that overall it's as many as some might want to think came around because of the Clone Wars. Nor do I think it was people who really and truly didn't like those films that had a change of heart. Maybe some, but certainly not a lot. Because I mean, if you hated the prequels with a passion, if you were one of those fans who said George Lucas had ruined your childhood or done something worse to it, you probably never gave the Clone Wars a chance. And if you did, I would be surprised if you got past the Clone Wars movie and the first few seasons, which, if we're being brutally honest, they were a bit rough around the edges. And this, I think, would be similar to how people nowadays who hate the sequel say they will never ever give a chance to anything sequel related, including refusing to see the upcoming Rey movie. Basically, if you hated the prequels, like if you hate the sequels, and I mean have a true and genuine hatred for them, you don't want to see them redeemed. You're not willing to give anything around them a chance, and if you do, you're going to be extremely harsh or judgmental, and you're going to look for reasons not to like them. And so, going back to the second question, I think what's likely responsible for this recent surge of love and or appreciation for the prequels is a couple different things, and sadly you could say none of them are really a reevaluation of the movies themselves. First of all, if you really hated the prequels when they came out, somewhere along the way over the past couple decades now, you probably just stopped caring so much. Not caring about Star Wars itself maybe, or about the OT that you did love, but caring about hating on the prequels. Second, if you were young when the prequels came out, if that's your generation's Star Wars, you're obviously much older now, probably mid to late 20s or even early 30s, maybe even a little older, and you're going to have a, shall we say, louder voice in the world than you did when you were 10 years old perhaps, especially when you consider if you were indeed around the age of 10 at the height of the prequels, it then means you would have essentially grown up into the age of social media, and thus you're far, far more likely, I'd wager, to be interacting with social media today and making your voice heard on it far more so than someone who was, say, 10 years old when the original trilogy came out. In other words, a lot of prequel haters don't care so much anymore, and even if they do, they aren't bitching about those films all over social media, whereas prequel fans are on social media, obviously praising them and making it feel like, yeah, everyone is now suddenly loving them, when there are still plenty of people silently hating them out there in the world. A third thing to keep in mind is that there are certainly some fans out there who now think the sequels are far, far worse than the prequels were, and maybe miss when George Lucas owned Star Wars and have kind of shifted their opinions a bit on the films. Nostalgia, as the comment suggests, is probably playing a part here as well to some degree. A fourth and final factor then is, I think, the number of people, especially young people at the time, who became fans because of watching the Clone Wars, it being their introduction to Star Wars. I think that number is perhaps underestimated and underestimated quite a bit. There were a lot of kids who watched that show at the time, and then almost by default, they probably became prequel fans, or perhaps had their love for the prequels reaffirmed, or it was allowed to continue and to grow stronger, if you will, because they had something they could keep watching attached to it. I do think the Clone Wars had an impact on appreciation for the prequels, but I think it was mainly from the younger crowd, not the older one, if that makes sense. That then sort of brings us full circle, or back to the question of, can anything do something similar for the sequels? Is there anything that can redeem them or make them seem like they've been redeemed, or just increase the number of fans they have? Which also then ties into the question of, do I think the Rey movie can be a success and make money? And the answer to that is, can the Rey movie make money? Of course it can, in theory. I do think it has a pretty big uphill battle ahead of it, considering that, yeah, a lot of people do not like the sequels and will, as I was just saying, they will refuse to see the film almost out of principle. But if in 2.5 years or so it is the first Star Wars film to hit theaters, if it beats The Mandalorian and Grogu, it will get a lot of interest and attention for being the first Star Wars film back in roughly 6 or 7 years. A lot of casual viewers or normies, they will once again flock to the theater for Star Wars, probably. And I say probably because with Star Wars having multiple shows a year on Disney Plus these days, with it never truly leaving the spotlight or the public consciousness, if you will, it's not going to have quite the same hype it would have had it truly been off the radar for several years at this point. And speaking of that, I almost think the best bet for the Rey movie would be for the Mandalorian and Grogu movie to come out first, and to be really, really good, if not excellent and beloved, because obviously that will generate more excitement for the Rey movie that follows, again among the casuals or the normies or whatever you would like to call them. The general audience will be more excited for another Star Wars movie if the one they just saw was really good. And look, if the film is good and profitable and then ends up spawning some sequels, or if this becomes a whole new trilogy or whatever might happen to it, if the current young generation falls in love with these new movies and becomes Star Wars fans because of them, and thus sort of by default the sequels, which will be heavily attached to them, then yes, not all that far down the road, it is likely going to feel like the sequels have also had a resurgence, that people have magically come around to them, when in reality it'll probably be the younger crowd having a louder voice in society, and the older crowd who didn't like those films just not caring so much anymore to bitch about them. And so now going back to the first question, how likely do I personally think that is? What would be my way too early guess for the Rey film in terms of box office success or failure, given we know so little about it and it's still minimum 2.5 years away and may come out after the Mandalorian and Grogu film or before it, and that will impact it. Maybe good, maybe bad, depending on how that film is. Well, honestly, I do think a lot of people will initially give it a chance because it is Star Wars. I think it's going to do moderately well at the very least, and then its fate will be decided on how good it is or isn't. Because if it is good or really, really good, which, yes, that is possible, I think it'll do quite well. I think it could do really well. There are a lot of people out there who know they didn't like the sequels, but they don't hate them to the point where they wouldn't see anything related to them, especially if they hear what this new something is actually really, really good. However, if the film is really, really bad, I think it could be a box office disaster. Maybe not as bad as some might want it to be, but I think it could lose quite a bit of money. I think this could go a lot of different ways, to be honest with you. Again, it's way too early to predict these things. I think it has a very, very high ceiling, honestly, and I think it has a pretty equally low floor. And it will all come down to, again, how good the movie is or isn't. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and make your way too early prediction for the Rey movie, or tell me what you think about the recent surge in popularity for the prequels. Am I on the right track with what I was saying, or do you think it is something else entirely? Or you can always ask a question for a future lightning response video. All you got to do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.